Today we are reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. In your pew Bible, it is on page 784. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." The word of the Lord. Here we come to the first major point in Jesus' life. The first few chapters of the Gospel of Matthew are about Jesus being born. Jesus was coming, the story of Joseph and Mary, the story of Jesus being born, the story of Jesus as a youngling. And when we get to chapter 3, they start to talk about John the Baptist, who was going out and saying, "There's one who's coming after me." And we come to this point. Jesus, after 30 years of living what can only be called a fairly normal life, as a carpenter, as a member of society, as a member of the community, a member of the Sabbath day celebrations and worship, a member of the synagogue, Jesus was moving from what we can call a normal life to the life that he was called to share here. This moment, this time of baptism, this time of renewal can be called something of a turning point for Jesus. Jesus had come to this moment, though we don't know very much about Jesus' life between after he was born and when he was baptized. We don't know much about it. We have a story in Luke about him as a 12-year-old who stayed behind at the temple, and his parents didn't realize it until a day later, and when they came back and found him, he was teaching in the temple as a 12-year-old. Other than that, we find no stories about him. Though there are some non-canonical books written about Jesus as a child, some of them are a little crazy, so we tend not to put much emphasis on them. So we assume that Jesus lived a normal life, and I want to assume that because it makes sense, doesn't it? God came into human history to be a part of what we are, of who we are. And how much more human can it be than to just have a normal, routine, day-to-day life? Most of us live by a routine. We get up at a certain time. We get ready for work. We go to work. We work all day. We come back. We eat dinner. Maybe we shower if we had a sweaty day. And then we go back, maybe watch some TV. Starts over again. How much more human could it be that Jesus had a routine? Maybe he got up every morning, got ready for work, worked as a carpenter with his dad Joseph, then came home and did things at home. Maybe he was just like one of us. Actually, I like to believe that he was just like one of us, because then he can truly understand what it means to be human. For too often, we always put the big moments as why we are human, and all of those important moments as our life. But yet the truth is 99% of our life is not lived in those extreme moments of sadness or gladness or celebration or depression. It's not lived in those ends, at those extremes. It's lived in the everyday. It's lived in the everyday routine. It's lived in the common things. So for Jesus, he had led a fairly common life until this moment. This moment was his turning point. Too often, we come to points in our life, and like a crossroads, we can go left or right, but we decide to just continue forward on the same path that we know because we were afraid to make a left or a right. Here, Jesus came to fulfill what he had been called to do, what he had come to do. From the moment that Adam and Eve fell until this moment, when Jesus steps into the water. This is why he came. It was his turning point from living a normal life and understanding humanity from a normal perspective to becoming and showing the world that he was Messiah. He was the Christ. That's why John says, why are you coming for me to baptize you? And remember, this is John, an important person, a prophet, a person who called people out into the River Jordan and got baptized. Normally, baptism was for Gentiles who wanted to become Jewish. They would be baptized into the Jewish faith. Normally, Jewish people didn't get baptized because they were already Jewish. But yet here, John is calling Jewish people, people of faith. You would assume that these people are people who go to synagogue every Sabbath and who do the things that are necessary. And yet they came to him and were baptized. And now this Jesus, God made human, came to John. And John said, why are you coming to me? I should be coming to you. But Jesus said, no, right now we need to do this as it is. And John baptized him, and at that moment, everything changed. At that moment, the ministry of Jesus truly began. It doesn't mean that he wasn't ministering before. It doesn't mean that he didn't bless people before, but now Jesus was going from a small community that he knew and knew him to the greater community that was about to understand that this Jesus of Nazareth wasn't just a man or someone who thought himself great, but he was and is Messiah. He had that turning point. Rather than continuing on the road that he knew, on the road that he had become accustomed to, on a road that every man led, Jesus made a turn. And he came to that moment and knew it was his time. What is a turning point? For many of us, we have come to our crossroads. For many of us, we have come to a time of trying to understand what it is that we need to do. For many of us, it feels like it's never just one or the other. It feels like there are a million different ways to go, and there's a million different ways that I want to go, and I can't spread myself that thin. So you tend to stay where you are. Have you experienced this moment at the crossroads? Have you experienced a moment when you knew you needed to do something but had no idea what to do and decided to stay where you were until something forced you to one way or the other? And if you did that, it was probably an unhappy time for you, wasn't it? Because a decision was forced upon you. Have you experienced a turning point when you come to a place that you know which way you need to go, and you made that turn and you walked that road? It was probably a time that was better for you knew where you needed to go and what you needed to do. Sometimes a turning point is a big moment, like with Jesus. He got into the water, he was baptized, And the Spirit of the Lord descended, and a voice from heaven came and said, "This is my beloved." But not all turning points are that dramatic. It would be easy to know when it was time if it was always that dramatic, wouldn't it? If every time you had to make a choice, if every time you had to make a turn, if every time your life came to a crossroads and you took a road and you heard the voice of God that said, "This is my beloved," then you'd know every time that this is the right road. But that's not how it functions. Oftentimes we doubt ourselves, like, should I leave this job even though I am unhappy with it and move into this other position that may be better but also may be worse, or maybe different in a bad way, or maybe we always have all these maybes and excuses. Should I retire? I've worked all these years. I've already passed the age of retirement. Is it time for me to retire? But then I won't make as much money. But then how can I do this? Can we survive? There's always the questions. Turning points in our life are crucial moments in our lives. Sometimes we make the right decision, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes when we don't make the right decision, there's another turning point that comes not too long after. Sometimes when we make the right decision, we won't reach another turning point for a long while. But turning points are part of living. Turning points are part of who we are, of what we are as humans, to be able to make it to the end of a road and then move into the next section of life, the next road of life. Because life is a journey, and it's never a simple journey from point A to point B. And even if it is point A to point B, it's never a straight line, right? It's usually a mess of angles, a mess of ways, a mess of roads that we take, and we stumble and we rise up again and we keep on going. It's never a straight shot from point A to point B. In our lives, there are many roads that we take. In our lives, there are many crossroads that we come to. In our life, there are turning points that are coming. Those of us who are going through and walking this journey, which is all of us, will at one point or another hit a turning point. And when we get to that point, are we willing to make the right decision? We have to analyze, and if you function like I do, you'll make a checklist of pros and cons, and what's the best thing on this road, and what's the wrong thing, and how can I make it if I do this, if I do that, if I don't, There's all these questions that are asked. But yet, when you make the right choice, and when you come to that crossroad and take that step, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was the right step. Likewise, when you take a step and it's the wrong one, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was the wrong step. And wrong steps are okay too, because they teach us. Most of the lessons that stay with us forever are the hardest lessons. Rarely are our lessons those that were easy, those that were like running through the flowers in a meadow towards a creek and it was beautiful. Those lessons almost never stay with us. But those hard lessons that we cried through, that we struggled through, that we felt like we wouldn't make it through, those are the lessons that have stayed with us. So the wrong step helps us in a way. It helps us to want to make the right choice. It helps us to want to take the right step, to take the right road, rather than just letting life take us where it will. And if we're willing to take the journey that God has called us on, if we are willing to take the steps that God has called us to, and if we are willing to carry the lessons of those things that we have learned, we will be led into a new life. And new life doesn't have to come from something completely new. New life can come from the remnants of what was. For many of us, who we were, what we were, will always be with us. But it doesn't mean that we have to be those things. God has called us to bring and be new life in this world, in our life today. Though the lessons we carry with us are always with us, it doesn't mean that we have to be the people that we were when we learned those lessons. Those lessons help us to be a better person, to make a better choice, to make the right choice. So we can create new life from the old remnants of a past life. God is helping us to bring this forward, one step at a time, one mini step. It doesn't always have to be a full step. It can be a baby step, a mini step. Maybe sometimes we just lean forward before we walk or step forward. New life comes from the remnants of our old. And today is the first day. Let us make today day one of our new journey. As we stood at the crossroads, let today be the day that we make the choice, that we use Jesus as the example of our turning point, where Jesus gave up routine and regular everyday things to show the world that he was Messiah. May we take that example and take the turn that God is calling us in order to leave behind the things that we are used to, the routine, the way it's always been, and live into a new life that God is calling us to. Live into a new being that God is creating within us, and live into a new day that God is making for us. Today is day one of what can be the rest of our life. Are we willing to make that choice? Are we willing to make today the turning point in our life? Are we willing to leave it all in God's hands and let God be God in our life, in our body, our mind, our heart,